Subscribe if you know what's good for you. Please. This case takes place in the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1980. Meet Nikolai Dzhumagaliev. He was born in the Kazakh Soviet Republic, now known as Kazakhstan. His mother and father raised 4 children, with Nikolai being their only son. His childhood was outwardly normal, marked by a stable upbringing in a working-class household. Neighbours and acquaintances recalled him as being polite and intelligent, showing no signs of violence or disturbance as a child. In his late teenage years, he completed school and immediately entered mandatory military service with the Soviet Army. Following his discharge from military service 2 years later, Nikolai attempted to enroll at university, but he was unsuccessful. He also failed to qualify for personal training as a truck driver. These setbacks deeply frustrated him. So instead, Nikolai drifted between basic jobs, never settling in one place or profession for too long. He worked briefly as a sailor, then as an electrician, bulldozer operator, freight forwarder, and eventually as a firefighter. Throughout these years, despite his transient lifestyle, Nikolai maintained an image of cleanliness, sophistication, and charm. Nobody knew that he was about to become the Ted Bundy of Kazakhstan. Something that made him stand out was his metal teeth. He had lost his natural front teeth in a teenage fistfight, and subsequently replaced them with a custom-made dental appliance cast from silver metal. From his late teenage years onwards, Nikolai was rather outgoing and had many casual relationships with women. However, he harboured increasingly dark thoughts about them. He viewed women as morally inferior beings, and over time, his hidden misogyny only deepened. In 1977, he contracted syphilis and trichomoniasis, 2 very serious sexually transmitted diseases. This experience was deeply distressing for him, both physically and psychologically, and the diagnosis only intensified his hostility towards women. In Nikolai's own disturbing rationalizations, he later claimed that these infections fueled his fantasies of violent revenge against what he perceived as immoral women, particularly women who sold their bodies. He began to obsessively nurture gruesome ideas about killing them. His reason was that if he consumed the bodies and the blood of women, it would purify him, and in some way make him superhuman. By the late 1970s, Nikolai had settled into a seemingly ordinary life, working as a firefighter in the local community. But he was also an avid hunter. He was skilled in tracking and killing game animals. But there's a twist. He started imagining himself as a predator, stalking human prey in the remote and isolated rural landscape surrounding his local area. And this fixation grew more severe with time. At the outset, it appeared like his unhinged thoughts were a symptom of a developing schizophrenia disorder, something that he would later be diagnosed with. His disturbed worldview became increasingly intertwined with symptoms of emerging schizophrenia, which further distorted his perceptions of reality. Throughout 1978 into 1979, Nikolai quietly prepared himself mentally for the horrifying crimes that he intended to commit. On the evening of the 24th of January 1979, 17-year-old Nadezhda Irokina was walking along the familiar rural road that she would usually walk along. Nadezhda was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, known in her area for her quiet kindness and her gentle nature. Friends remembered her as a girl who spent her weekends singing hymns at the local church, dreaming one day of becoming a teacher. A friend later said that Nadezhda was pure-hearted, always ready to help anyone. She was hardly an immoral person. However, this didn't matter much to Nikolai. As the sun set that January evening, Nikolai quietly closed in behind her. He went unnoticed as he walked along the path, and without warning, he seized Nadezhda. He dragged her off the roadside, and before she could let out a scream, he held her mouth closed. Nikolai then attempted to force himself upon her, but he found that she was too difficult to restrain. So instead, he slit her throat and then continued to force himself upon her. After Nikolai was done, he knelt down beside her. He then placed his mouth around Nadezhda's throat and began to drink her blood. But then, all of a sudden, a bus stopped nearby, so Nikolai wiped his lips and laid low beside the lifeless body and used her corpse for warmth as he hid. He then silently waited for this bus to move on. Once the bus moved on, he dragged Nadezhda's body into a position completely out of view of the road and got out his carving knife. He then systematically carved flesh from her thighs, hips and calves and wrapped the meat up in a cloth to take home. Satisfied with what he had done, Nikolai left and went home. He cooked and ate the flesh for the next month. The following day, Nadezhda's body was found, leaving her community traumatized and deeply confused. An investigation began to find whoever was responsible for this gruesome murder. However, there was a lack of evidence and absolutely no leads, leading investigators to grow ever more frustrated and allowing Nikolai to strike again. 3 months later, in April of 1979, Nikolai encountered a 70-year-old woman, Anna Marinova. Anna was walking home alone from an evening church service in a village called Fabricini. Anna was a frail grandmother, known affectionately for her unwavering faith. She, too, was a frequent churchgoer. Villagers often saw her feeding birds or offering sweets to local children. Her neighbour later tearfully remarked that Anna was the heart of kindness itself. Who would ever harm someone who was so gentle? But that night, Nikolai didn't care for her gentle nature. He went back to his methods. He hid in a bush beside the road, waiting for his next prey to walk into reach. It wasn't long before he ambushed Anna swiftly and brutally. He grabbed her and again slit her throat before she could even cry out. He then began to carve her body up just as he had done before, and he consumed her blood. Anna's mutilated body, which was partially dismembered and drained of blood, was later discovered by horrified locals, instilling fear throughout the area. Again, the investigators raced to find the killer, but they weren't quick enough. On the night of the 21st of June 1979, Nikolai committed an even more atrocious act. In a quiet village, he broke into the home of a 65-year-old woman named Alina Ivanova. Alina lived here with her 32-year-old daughter named Lida. Alina was a respected village elder. It was common for her to share produce from her garden with her neighbours and was known to be rather generous. Lida, her daughter, was known for her bright personality. She had been her mother's companion since childhood, inseparable through life's challenges. That evening, Nikolai broke in silently, and he crept through the apartment and first slit the throat of Alina with his knife, before stabbing her repeatedly. He then made his way through the apartment to Lida's room, and he did the exact same thing to her. But before he could carve up the women with his axe and knife, he had to check on a third and final room. This was the room of Lida's daughter. Whilst Lida didn't wake during the murder of Alina, a third young girl did. Lida's daughter heard the commotion. She was too scared to risk alerting her mother, so she kept completely quiet. She got out of bed and went inside a closet to hide. Nikolai entered her room and looked around, but thankfully she was able to remain completely silent. Somehow she remained quiet enough to avoid being caught. After looking around, Nikolai left her room. The two women were then mutilated in the previous ways. Just 6 days later, Nikolai targeted another woman, 23-year-old Valentina Prochaska. Valentina was a sociable young woman who dreamed of moving to the city for a better life. But tragically, Nikolai would put a stop to that. Under false pretenses, Nikolai invited Valentina into his home. The two began drinking vodka together, with the promise of being intimate. Once it started, Nikolai's mood quickly shifted into violence. Mid-intercourse, he strangled Valentina until she fell limp. He then reached for his knife, and just like he had before, he sliced her throat. As the blood began to leave her body, Nikolai put his lips around her neck and began to drink her blood. Nikolai dismembered her body, storing portions of flesh in barrels at his home before burying her bones in his yard. Her disappearance remained a mystery until Nikolai's later confession. Then, the police nearly caught him. On the 21st of August, Nikolai got into a fight with a fellow firefighter colleague, and he ended up shooting him. The firefighter didn't die, but he was soon arrested and charged. But he was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity after he was tested and diagnosed with schizophrenia. After a couple of weeks, he was released back into the public, and the second he was released, he resumed hunting women once again. Unfortunately, on the 8th of November 1980, Nikolai struck again. This time, it was a 26-year-old woman named Tatiana Garyova, and he chose her deliberately and timed the murder to coincide with the anniversary of his own grandmother's death. Tatiana had no reason to distrust the friendly, well-dressed man who approached her. Nikolai lured her into isolation, offering companionship and hospitality before revealing his true intentions. Once alone, he unleashed a vicious assault. He essayed Tatiana violently, and then, with chilling precision, he stabbed and hacked at Tatiana's neck with an axe and a knife. As she lay dying, but still conscious, Nikolai bent down towards her neck and began drinking blood directly from the open wound. He was still convinced that this granted him occult powers. After Tatiana died, more horror unfolded. Nikolai methodically dismembered her corpse, cutting out her organs and carving away her breasts and thighs. He took the meat home, salting portions and rendering the fat. He would later say, "I ate that woman's meat for almost a month." Nikolai had also taken her organs. This time, he wanted to experiment by frying Tatiana's heart and kidneys. Any remains he didn't consume were hidden or discarded. On the 13th of December 1980, he struck again. Again on another memorable date, his grandfather's 100th birthday. His next victim was a 22-year-old woman named Valia Soika. He persuaded Valia to visit his home. Alone and vulnerable, she suffered a savage attack. Nikolai essayed her both before and after killing her, fully embracing his twisted desires. Valia died from a frenzy of stab wounds all over her body. In the same old fashion following her death, he dismembered her body, drank her blood, and stored her flesh in his refrigerator, eating her for days. In a sinister twist, he turned her meat into pelmeni, which is a traditional meat dumpling. He then chillingly served them up to unsuspecting friends at a gathering just 5 days later. It was during this dinner party where he served up the remains of a murdered woman that he would kill again. The dinner party was held on the 18th of December 1980. 27-year-old Zoya Slivka attended the dinner party at Nikolai's home with 2 other males. They ate and drank into the night, unaware that they were served human meat. Later into the evening, Nikolai quietly led Zoya into a private room. In moments, he attacked, essayed her, and then killed her with brutal slashes to the throat. However, Nikolai didn't expect the other 2 men to look inside his room. Moments later, the 2 men peered into the room to check on them both. They were curious about the sudden absence of their host and their female friend, and what they saw shattered their understanding of reality. As the 2 men entered, they saw Nikolai completely naked, drenched from head to toe in blood. His hands were gripping a blade as he calmly butchered Zoya's mutilated corpse. Beside him, on a nearby table, lay the severed head and various internal organs of Zoya. The 2 horrified guests screamed in terror and fled the house immediately. In a state of panic, they stumbled into the street. But Nikolai was alerted by their screams, and he attempted to pursue them, brandishing a bloody axe. It was literally something out of a nightmare, but the 2 men managed to escape into the darkness, racing frantically to alert the authorities. That very same night, police officers rushed to Nikolai's home in response to the reports from the traumatized witnesses who had seen Nikolai butchering their friend. Upon entering the house, even hardened officers recoiled at the incomprehensible horror that awaited them inside. Blood soaked the walls and the floors. They found the hidden head from the previous victim, along with human meat inside his fridge. Amid the chaos, Nikolai himself emerged. He was still naked, covered in blood, and clutching his weapons. Incredibly, as the stunned officers momentarily hesitated at the sight before them, Nikolai seized the opportunity to flee. He charged past the officers, sprinting naked and blood-soaked into the freezing night, gripping his axe as he vanished into the darkness. Officers quickly regained composure and initiated a frantic search of the surrounding areas. The police deployed additional resources, including tracking dogs and militia reinforcements. They were of course very determined not to let a dangerous killer escape. Their efforts proved to be successful, however, as by the following day, Nikolai was located hiding at the home of a relative in a nearby town. Nikolai was apprehended without further violence. With him now secured in custody, investigators began piecing together the full extent of his horrendous crimes. Police began to find personal items belonging to multiple previous victims, further linking him to earlier unsolved murders across the region. When confronted by the investigators, Nikolai calmly and readily confessed, speaking openly about the murders with chilling detachment. He recounted his gruesome acts, describing how he hunted, killed, and consumed his victims without remorse or regret. Nikolai attempted to rationalize his crimes, describing himself as a crusader who targeted immoral women. However, evidence soon refuted these claims. Psychiatric evaluations quickly confirmed the severity of Nikolai's schizophrenia. Doctors determined that his mental illness profoundly influenced his actions, yet investigators remained equally convinced of his clear intent and his calculated brutality. The horrors uncovered by authorities reverberated throughout Soviet law enforcement circles, as even experienced investigators struggled to process the reality of Nikolai's horrifying crimes. Using Nikolai's detailed confessions as a roadmap, investigators systematically matched his accounts to earlier unsolved murders dating back to January of 1979. His recollections proved extraordinarily precise, as he coolly identified crime locations, described exact methods of killing, and even demonstrated specific butchering techniques used on the victims' bodies. Nikolai admitted openly to post-mortem essays and detailed the methodical ways that he dismembered the bodies. The precision of these actions indicated careful planning and clear intent. Rumors and unofficial reports suggested that Nikolai might have actually killed more women than officially documented, possibly dozens more whose disappearances remained unexplained. However, Soviet investigators limited their official case files to the murders conclusively supported by the evidence. Ultimately, they charged Nikolai formally with 7 out of the 9 murders committed between January of 1979 and December of 1980. A crucial element of the investigation was the detailed eyewitness testimonies provided by the 2 male guests who narrowly escaped with their lives. Despite their severe emotional trauma, both men provided detailed, consistent, and credible statements, describing vividly the horror that they had witnessed. Throughout the investigation, the Soviet authorities remained cautious about publicizing details. They were concerned that revealing the existence of such a prolific, cannibalistic serial killer would create widespread panic. So instead, investigators conducted their work quietly. But they couldn't stop the rumors and the stories of a man who ritualistically killed, essayed, and ate victims and drank their blood to absorb their souls. The locals nicknamed Nikolai Metal Fang, due to, of course, the metal teeth he had in his head. In December of 1981, Nikolai faced formal proceedings before a Soviet court. Although his guilt was never in question due to the overwhelming evidence, the central issue presented to the court was his mental state at the time of his crimes. The courtroom's atmosphere was solemn and devoid of the typical heated exchanges of criminal trials. Throughout the trial, Nikolai displayed a calm and composed demeanor, often appearing detached and unemotional as the evidence was presented. He listened passively, occasionally acknowledging specific details, yet exhibited no visible signs of remorse or distress. At certain moments, Nikolai even corrected prosecutors on factual points regarding the murders, almost appearing casually invested in the accuracy of his story. The judge also carefully examined the extensive psychiatric evaluations conducted by medical professionals. These reports of course concluded that Nikolai was suffering from severe schizophrenia, significantly impairing his understanding of reality and morality during his killings. And as a result, Nikolai was found not guilty by reason of insanity, absolving him of traditional criminal responsibility under Soviet law. Instead of receiving a criminal prison sentence, Nikolai was ordered by the court to be indefinitely detained in a secure psychiatric facility for mandatory treatment. Following the court's ruling, Nikolai was transferred to a high-security hospital where his confinement would begin. His initial confinement at the hospital was strictly supervised, involving treatment plans and closely monitored medication regimens intended to control his psychotic episodes and his violent impulses. However, that wasn't the end of Metal Fang's diabolical and twisted ways. In August of 1989, a shocking incident occurred when Nikolai managed to escape during a supervised transfer. His sudden escape caused a discreet yet urgent manhunt across multiple Soviet republics. Authorities were determined to prevent a public panic, so they chose not to disclose Nikolai's escape immediately. Instead, they quietly intensified their search efforts behind closed doors, and, despite their best efforts, Nikolai evaded capture for nearly 2 years. He skillfully hid in a remote mountainous region, relying on survival skills to avoid detection, eating wild animals so he could survive. Despite an extensive search effort involving Soviet militia units, KGB personnel, and aerial surveillance, Nikolai successfully remained at large. He kept a low profile, but that was until a bold and unusual move. Nikolai attempted to misdirect authorities by sending a letter to a close friend of his, suggesting that he was now living in Moscow. The letter finished with Nikolai's reassurance that he would not return home because there were many women in Moscow and nobody would miss them. This letter caused temporary panic when intercepted by the authorities, who privately knew the danger that Nikolai presented. And what's tragic is that he did strike again. On the 28th of July 1990, Nikolai encountered a 24-year-old woman, Gulmira Maratova. Gulmira was a local university student, and on this day, Nikolai approached her using a fake name. He managed to gain her trust before guiding her to a secluded location away from prying eyes. In isolation, he revealed his lethal intentions, swiftly overpowering and essaying Gulmira. Like he had done many times before, he then cut her throat and stabbed her multiple times, before proceeding to mutilate her corpse further. When authorities discovered her body, Gulmira had been decapitated. It was clear to the investigators who had done this. However, Nikolai soon became tired of living a life in hiding. So, he stole a sheep and falsely claimed that he was a Chinese national named Yang Ye. Of course, the local authorities quickly became suspicious of his story, and they contacted a higher Soviet investigating team. They soon discovered that this Chinese man was in fact Nikolai. Following his recapture, Nikolai was returned to a secure psychiatric institution and was eventually transferred to a specialized facility after the Soviet Union's collapse. As years passed, Nikolai himself became a figure of morbid fascination, symbolizing the existence of profound evil beneath an ordinary exterior. Nikolai has since remained confined securely in a psychiatric institution, although every now and then people share rumors that he has escaped again. In one such incident in January of 2016, a viral social media hoax falsely claimed that Nikolai had escaped once again, causing a brief but intense wave of panic. Today, Nikolai remains in a secure facility in Kazakhstan, and his story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can exist undetected, concealed behind the mask of polite normalcy, forever altering the lives of victims, their families, and entire communities.